Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like, because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and any issues related to those issues. Today I want to continue on my deconversion story for 2023, and this is part 7, and I want to talk about today basically my first church. This is where I became a senior pastor. Now, if you remember last time, I was getting disgruntled with the fact that I was putting in about 30 hours a week at the church, 40 hours a week at another job. I literally helped build this church from 45 to like 120 along with the pastor in a couple of years. And I felt that I was kind of, do something. We're quoting those verses of scripture: "The labor is worthy of his hire. Don't muzzle the ox that treads out the corn, so to speak." And the board, because I'd grown up there, and because of the previous pastor kind of poisoning the well with me a little bit, they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't even give me $100 a week for my time, and so. At that point, I began to apply for churches in the Assemblies of God. By this time, I had gotten my license to preach in 1999, and I love the little ceremony. They give you a little crying towel, we call it. It's basically a servant's towel. You're supposed to be servant-hearted and all that things as a pastor. And so I had my license to preach at this point, and I was just parlaying, trying to find a place that could support me and my family. My kids knew that I wanted to be in the ministry and that we could move, though I'm never really sure, how that would work out with them. I always actually feel bad a little bit about having to uproot them so much in their life, so hopefully they've forgiven me for that. But they'll have to tell their own stories later on when, about dear old dad. I finally got word from a church in a little bit larger city than I was living in. It's not like a huge city, but like 10,000 people. I had a major employer at the time. There was just a lot of things going on, and I looked at the church. The church could easily about the same size as the church I was coming out of as far as a building. The amount of people that were in the church, though, was a lot less, like 45 roughly. And I would find out that it was actually a lot worse than that, because the roster had kind of been padded. So when I did my official, I preached, and they decided whether or not to accept me as a pastor. Basically, there was a full house trying to figure this out. And then once I was selected, the next Sunday there was like 30 people. Okay, that's the kind of place it was. Everybody was interested in the politics of the church, but they weren't interested in coming every Sunday. So I got to the point where I was voted in. It was unanimous. And then discovered that this church had had a lot of bitterness towards the Michigan district of the Assemblies of God because of how they became district supervised. Now you have to understand there's 3 levels of churches in the Michigan district of the Assemblies of God, which is you have district supervised churches, which are literally the district. There are certain district officials that serve as the board of that church. The church is too small to have a board per se, so you have the district supplying that board, and that's usually, it has, there's different people that are in charge of district supervised churches, the local sectional overseer, whatever, and all that. And, secretary and all those people kind of serve on that board along with the pastor of the church. So I was walking into that situation after coming out of a fully autonomous, which is the highest rank. And in the middle is kind of semi-independent, where you have your own board, but you don't have enough members. Okay, this is where the misogyny comes in, where you have to have male leadership. You have to have at least 6 people eligible to serve on the board, but you only have a board of 3, but you have to have 6 people eligible in order to be a fully autonomous church. So they were at the lowest level, and so my board was mostly provided by the district between the sectional leaders and the leadership area and the person in charge of leadership and myself. And then, of course, I had two guys from the church that I would talk to once a month about what was going on, and that's the situation. Now, the problem was that the way they had become a district supervised church is the district had basically come in and said, you don't have enough eligible people to be on your board, so we're going to drop you back down to district supervised. And the problem is when I talked to members of the congregation who had been at that meeting, they were looking around the room and saw at least 10 men that were eligible to be in that position. But what it was is the leadership of that church was telling the pastor was basically going to school on the side. He was only there 30 hours a week. He said, we're only paying you for a full-time gig and you're not, showing up. And so there was a conflict between the previous pastor and the board, and that caused him to fall down. And then there was a pastor in between him and me that only lasted a couple of years. But because they were very bitter about the fact that the district just swooped in, and they didn't trust the district at all, okay? And by the same token, the district was wanted to really, clamp down on this church, membership requirements, everything. And so long story short, I'm a rookie pastor in a very volatile situation, and I made a lot of rookie mistakes. I will own my half of the failure of this church, because I would be the last pastor of this church, because after I left, they only had 6 people left, and they basically voted to shut down the church and disband and sell the building, which they did. And, I spent a year after that still living in this town because we had purchased a home, but I could never find work. Okay, I couldn't even find a basic job at anything. And, I kept trying to, apply for new churches, but the district had moved so quickly in shutting down the church that I didn't really have time to move on with anything. And I just didn't have a time, we were in a real financial bind. And there were a lot of other things going on in the world around us too. The economy tanked because 9/11 happened. And this is where I was during 9/11. It was funny, I chose to change my day off to Tuesday that day, and lo and behold. But it just changed the way the economy was. And after that, the major employer in that town shut down, and so everybody was out of work. And I just couldn't find a job. My wife had a job, and she was kind of supporting the family, and we were bare minimaling it there for about a year after I left this church, trying to find another work. And we lost our home, everything that came about because of this bad blood. And it was a real disaster. The thing is, we poured a lot of money into it when I first got there. We got the roof repaired, we got carpeting, we took out the old pews, we put in new chairs. I had a lot of talent on my worship team, but that was so what the focus of the church was the worship team, and I was there to preach. I of course taught Life of Christ again, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'm always been a good teacher in that respect, but the church really, for me, was a training ground of realizing what I shouldn't do as a pastor. And a couple things not only affected me in how to view leadership, but also how things really were. One of the things that really began to upset me is how much the district when you have a church that small, they come in and they really control everything you do. They wanted really strict membership requirements. And I lost half my worship team because half of them weren't members of the church, and we can't have anybody on the platform that isn't a member of the church. And it's like, for the love of God. I began to just get mad about that because we were literally pushing people out the door, okay, because of these strict religious standards. And, every time I'd go to a district meeting, they were always asking for money, and I'm like, I got no money, and my church is barely making it. And I would be like, I'm on minimum wage. I missed, paychecks because sometimes the offering just didn't cover them. The first year was really good, but after that it slowly went downhill until it was very, very much struggling for existence. The final straw came when, the rest of the worship team just quit. They were done. And I had no worship team. I literally walked in the next Sunday and realized I was going to have to just get up and preach because there was nothing, I grabbed the hymnal and we sang a few songs and then I preached and we called it a day. And that's kind of the way it ended. And I called the district, said I'm done. But I was ordained at that time in May 2001. I did my ordination, and that's when things were fairly decent. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And 9/11, of course, there was a typical problem of evil issues, and the fact that these people that did this were religiously motivated. I began to have my doubts about religion altogether as a general rule. But the whole thing just kind of focused things on, for me, on Pentecostalism and its relationship to, yes, the Bible. Because Pentecostals believe that the stuff that Jesus did and the stuff that happened in Acts can still happen today. And I began to see how that came about in action. And one of the things I began to note is how much crap there was to it. There was just a lot of fraud. Divine healing, for instance, is very much believed by Assemblies of God, Pentecostal people. And, the placebo effect was responsible for 90% of it. You got prayed for it. Oh, I feel better. I still went to the doctor the next day, but, I feel better today. I've been healed. The real name it and claim it, grab it and blab it kind of doctrine was going around at that time. I had to enforce tithing rules, which, nobody loved that at all. Giving 10% to the church, it was just, there were so many restrictions on membership that I really had a problem maintaining any members, and it was just bad. But also, I began to compare what Jesus did in the Gospels and some of the things I was seeing in Pentecostalism, and suddenly realizing that Jesus could really be a charlatan, fraud, faith healer. Because who goes back and verifies any of this? When you look at all the miracles that Jesus does, there's no real verification of any of them. They're just stories. Okay, and it was the same in the Pentecostal church, because I would note how something went from something very mundane to being a miracle. Like I would pray for somebody, lay hands on them, anoint them with oil and all that jazz. And, I feel so much better. And it went from pastor prayed for me and I felt a little bit better to pastor prayed for me and I went into the doctor and this ailment was gone, so I've been healed. Well, when I follow up on it, it'd be like, well, I didn't know that I had that for sure. And I went to the doctor and the doctor said, no, I don't have that. But I figured God healed me. And it's a lot of that self-fulfilling stuff that you see in Pentecostalism. And I began to realize that the same kind of things could be happening every time you read a story of miracles in the Bible or whatever. And what you begin to realize very, very quickly is that you can have the best intentions, but a lot of things ends up being fraud. I mean, of course, Pentecostals believe in speaking in tongues. I've demonstrated on this channel before how that's easily a learned behavior. People feeling that there was a real heavy atmosphere of the Spirit. You get the whiz-bang worship. One of the things that happened after 9/11 is, if you're familiar with Hillsong Church in Australia and their worship team at the time, they sent us like a CD of their music after 9/11, and I began to get interested in them. And this is the early days of the internet, so I was able to look at them, watch a video of some of their services, real choppy stuff back there, and then the late 90s, early 2000s. But I began to realize there's a lot of emotion in this thing called Pentecost, and there's not a lot of cerebral. In fact, the one thing that was cerebral was me studying leadership, and I was introduced to a concept, a philosophical concept that I still, dwell on from time to time today, and that is the idea of self-deception. And where I got that from was a book by the Arbinger Institute called Leadership and Self-Deception. And I read the book, and the idea of you can deceive yourself. And self-deception basically is you begin to look at other people as objects. And when you start looking at them objects, you begin to diminish their morality. You begin to bring their morality down. You begin to bring their character down, and you exalt yourself. And that's what self-deception is. It's the essence of tribalism. okay, really to me, is the out group is over there, I'm the in group. The in group is better than the out group, okay? But when you start to see each other as human beings, and you start to break down those barriers, then you begin to look at yourself more realistically and in a less self-deceptive way, and you begin to look at the other side more realistically, and you're not devaluating them. And self-deception as a philosophical concept entered my life, and I began to realize, I can be self-deceived by a lot of things, and religion is inherently self-deceptive because it's inherently tribalistic. I have the truth and nobody else does. I believe the truth, nobody else does. And so you are able to exalt yourself and then look at other people and say, well, they don't have Jesus, so that's why they're struggling. Okay, that's why they're not great people. And you begin to do this diminishing of others because you think you found the truth. And as I began to realize this, I began to realize that there could be a lot of things wrong with religion in general and not just my own faith. And I was beginning to look at the text of the scripture and realize there's a lot of stuff here that if Jesus was like this guy who began to develop an understanding of human nature, he could easily, and if he had a good knowledge of the Old Testament, and if he had an understanding of people, and he could easily pull off some of the things in the Bible that I was seeing as fraud in the Pentecostal church. We would have revivals, and you'd have a guy, an evangelist, come and he would preach. And at the time, there was a big revival happening in Grand Rapids, that everybody was going to in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and in one of the churches. And the guy would get up there, and I went to it, and I suddenly realized that this guy was slick. Okay, and I only went once because he would preach. He had a lot of emotional, and he would create this, you need to be part of what is holy and good. That's what the essence of this revival is we're getting back to holiness and getting back to really seeking after God. And if you're not doing that, you're going to be left behind, kind of thing. And then they call us to the altar, and people are getting slain in the spirit or whatever. And I began to realize what that was. Because if you come to a service with expectation, you have this great worship team, you have all this stuff, you bring people there, they get prayed for, whatever, and then it falls apart. People expect to get slain in the spirit as soon as you touch their forehead, and they'll just fall over. And you see that in some of the televangelists, but we were having it there. And I'm going to be honest, the more I began to look at this, the more I began to realize how many miracles really are real, how many of this is real. And at this point in my life, I'm having some serious doubt about Pentecostalism, and I'm having some serious doubt about Jesus himself, okay, because I began to realize that he had some problems as far as I could see where what I was seeing up on the stage of this revival could easily be this man known as Jesus. Because when you hear the description of his preaching at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, what does it say? Well, they marveled because he wasn't teaching like the scribes would. He was teaching with authority. Okay, like he was really laying it out there. He was being, this is the truth. And that's kind of the way good preaching works. I mean, good in air quotes, because if you're just, I used to try to preach, with just being real intellectual, break down the text and talk about what it meant. But I never got response until I started to put a lot of emotion behind it. And you begin to realize that this is an emotional social club that doesn't really have a lot of, epistemological ideas floating by it. It's not about, getting together and talking about the intellectual qualities that Christianity has. And I began to realize that, this whole thing was falling apart. And by the time I ended up spending, I can't remember, it was either 6 months to a year where I was looking for my second church. I was unemployed for 6 months, very depressed, looking back at it through the autism lens. One of the things I got constantly as a minister in the Assemblies of God is that I came off cold. And what that meant is I just didn't express a lot of emotion. And now I know what that was. Okay, that's my autistic self saying, yeah, I'm going to be the world champion of masking here, and I'm not going to tell you what I'm feeling, even as a pastor. And, a lot of people said they got past that because they realized I did care. I just didn't express it very well. But most people couldn't get past that. And as a Pentecostal preacher, I was an abysmal failure with the emotional stuff. And so I was always considered like a lesser Pentecostal preacher, but a really good preacher for, getting into the Bible. But yeah, I began to realize that I could be self-deceived, that a lot of the things happening in Pentecostalism could easily be replicated throughout the years, would have no supernatural anything involved with any of it. I began to realize that there was a lot more dirty politics in church than I cared to think about. There was, every time I would have contact with our Michigan district and we'd meet as a board, it was always about, make sure they're tithing, make sure they're giving money, make sure they're giving money, make sure they're giving money. You need to have a revival in your church so people will give more money. And it's like, as somebody who disliked all of that in general in the first place, this really gnawed at me. And, it was really bad because it was one of the lower points in my life. I didn't get so depressed as like I did with my dad, but I was having a hard time with it. And my kids were having a hard time with the fact that we're going to have to move again. And, it'd only been 2-3 years. And so, when I picked up and left that situation, I was just very distraught, very upset about things. And, I would end up moving on to another church. But I would say rookie mistakes, bad management decisions by the Michigan district, constant desire for more and more money. It just became a real mess for me. And my doubts, am I being self-deceived about my faith? Am I looking at the life of Christ and seeing some of the things I'm seeing up on the stage of these great revivals, quote unquote? And I began to realize that a lot of this could be a fraud. A lot of it could be just garbage. And I turned at that point to really trying to find the theology of the scripture. And this is about the same time I started to become involved in online forums. I began to write back and forth with other pastors and theologians. The internet, the good old dial-up internet where you could, do texting and things like that was really there, back in the days of AOL and You Got Mail. And that's kind of where this era was. And the internet was kind of my saving grace. And, this first church was just, and I look back at it with a lot of, part of my fault, part theirs. It was just a big disaster waiting to happen. And the real toll was on my family and my kids, my marriage. We started out so well there, and then it ended up so much crap. And, when they had to close the church after I left, about the only bright spot is once they sold the building, they sent me all my back pay they owed me, which came just at the right time as we were moving into the second church. So that was kind of the way it went. Well, that's it for this one. I think I want to interrupt my chronological order. I think next week I'm going to talk about the influence of fantasy and sci-fi on my view of the Bible at this time, because there's an overarching thing that's happening with me from the time I'm a Christian ed pastor until I leave the ministry, that 20-year span. And it's something that was happening all the time. And so I want to cover that because I think a good place to cover that is in between the two churches, because I began to realize this was happening in the first church and it kind of come to the end. But I'll talk more about that next week. Thanks once again for stopping by. We're getting very close to memberships. $29.90 at this point. I think this point last year I was getting a lot of watch hours, so we're just kind of replacing the watch hours that we were losing at this point. So just keep that in mind. Keep watching videos and keep doing it. It'll happen. I do appreciate all of you. Thanks for stopping by. Go out, live your best life. You only get one go around, and so make it a good one. throw off the trappings of religion and belief and go for something that's real and work on something that'll make your life meaningful and happy. And do it with a smile on your face. Thanks once again for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.